All right, so in this particular EdPuzzle, we're going to focus on two taxonomic groups. One is insects, which are contained within phylum Arthropoda, and the other is phylum Echinodermata. So for insects, we're going to focus on mainly their relationship with plants, as well as their complex life cycle involving both complete or incomplete metamorphosis. And then for echinoderms, of course, we're going to go through any shared-derived characteristics that they have and how we would distinguish different classes of those particular organisms. I believe we have 5 classes to learn about.
Okay, so on to insects. This is our last group of arthropods. And again, the most diverse. So upwards of probably about 90% of arthropod species are insects. And these guys, again, all over the map. We've got grazing herbivores, we've got predators, we've got parasites. We have, ones that are dangerous, ones that are not so dangerous. We again see the tracheal system for use in respiration. We also have another shared-derived character down here, this Malpighian tubules. So these are basically for excretion, essentially like a kidney. So we have a specialized function there, but you can see the tracheal system going all over the body there in our little grasshopper. So I'm sure this is very familiar for you guys because of what you had to know for lab. But yeah, all sorts of different types of insects. Fortunately, we don't have to deal with orders. So yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot of orders of insects. So yeah, flies. Now notice that there's bugs is on the list, right? So all bugs are insects, but technically not all insects are bugs. There is actually an order of insects called the true bugs. Okay, so more good examples of form and function are the mouth parts in insects. And so again, you can probably tell exactly what, or at least have a good idea of what something eats by looking at its mouth parts. So you have, for example, the beetle on the left. All right, we have chewing mouth parts. So this is again a grazer. So you're eating plant material and chewing it up. The butterfly is, they have a very long, the proboscis is basically just almost like a long extendable straw. It's rolled up. And it's used for sucking up nectar out of flowers. Then you have the piercing mouth parts on the bug, a true bug this time. These guys generally are piercing through the outer dermis in a plant and trying to get to the phloem, trying to get to where all the sugar and the calories are, the sugar and the protein. And so true bugs would be things like kissing bugs, potato bugs, things like that. And then you have the bee, which has really interesting mouth parts. So you have a little tongue for lapping up the nectar, but then you also have chewing mouth parts, and those are mostly for pollen, actually. Chewing is a great source of protein for them. And so you're chewing up the whatever pollen doesn't get picked up on their legs or the rest of their body. They actually chew it and eat it. So again, you can tell from the shape of the mouth parts exactly what, how somebody makes a living, how do they get their food. Okay, so another thing we see in insects, we also see this in other arthropods and some other animals as well. We have two different, basically, types of life cycles in insects. And one is it's called direct development, aka incomplete metamorphosis. And so the young, when they hatch out, this is sort of what we're typically used to, is you end up with basically a young animal that looks like a miniature adult. Mostly they go through some changes, changes in the last stage where they reach sexual maturity. And so you have some additional changes in the last stage. But remember, these guys have to molt their exoskeleton every time in order to get bigger, right? So if they want to get larger and they want to grow, they actually have to shed their exoskeleton and get larger. And so consequently, they go through a series of stages that are called, well, in this case, nymph stage, but it's also sometimes called instars. And so that is, so here we've got our nymphs. This would be like, this would be the first instar stage, and then this would be the second instar. And then we have the third, and so on, right until you get to the adult. And successive molts of their exoskeleton. And so this is what we typically think of when we think of a lot of animals are like this, right? And what hatches out is basically a miniature adult and just gets bigger as time goes on. You have maybe a few changes that happen, but you just get bigger and bigger and bigger until you get to an adult stage. What also is cool about insects is we have internal fertilization that's occurring either as a result of internal mating, or you have something kind of like we saw with the octopus, where the female picks up a sperm packet, or it gets deposited inside, and it's called the spermatophore. And those again can be used as nuptial gifts, because you can pack the spermatophore not just with sperm, but also with calories and other beneficial things for the female, which of course is going to benefit your own offspring as well. So in a way, there's some parental care in there. So in contrast to incomplete metamorphosis, many insects exhibit what's called complete metamorphosis. So basically they go through at least two separate, entirely separate stages that are really different in their structure and often in terms of what they eat and things like that. So generally the larval stage, this would be the equivalent to the caterpillar here in the monarch butterfly life cycle. Generally you're eating plant material, right? They've got chewing mouth parts. We see the segmentation, but they obviously no wings, right? So the larva's job is going through those instar stages, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and at some point it's ready to transform itself into the adult stage, the last stage, and so it goes through what's called the pupal stage. And the nice thing about the pupal stage is they can, depending on the conditions, a lot of insects overwinter in the pupal stage because they're essentially in what's called diapause. Basically, it's just sort of like a suspended animation, kind of like hibernation, or when we talked about bryophytes being able to survive without their water, or endospores and bacteria, right? So it's a way of waiting out the bad conditions. And waiting for things to be good again. They can't keep it up forever, but they can stay in that stage for months at a time if necessary. And what's cool about that is they're essentially, their body liquefies and then reforms. It's kind of gross, but it's a really spectacular transformation because, of course, what comes out looks nothing like the animal that went in the first place, right? You have, we have legs, but the legs are jointed, but they look really different from a caterpillar's legs. You have much more well-defined body regions, the tagmosis, right? So you've got a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, and attached to the thorax are typically wings, generally, not always, but typically. And so this is what we call complete metamorphosis. So you go through separate life stages. And of course, the larva is getting focused on eating and getting bigger, and the adult is mainly focusing on reproduction. That's their big job. So in the case of butterflies, the males actually don't even eat. They don't even bother. The females eat mostly so that they can make eggs, and they don't live terribly long. So they actually spend most of their life in the larval and the pupal stage, and not as much time in the adult. In general, there are exceptions. The monarchs are actually an exception to that. Individuals can live for up to a year because they actually migrate long distances. The wings don't take the place of the walking legs. They're in addition to the walking legs. And it's thought that they started off as their wings are basically just folds in the cuticle, the outer exoskeleton layer. And it's thought that they started off as like little nubs, just little dimples, and expanded over time. And it was the idea being that wings were first used, or at least when they were sort of proto wings or winglets, whatever, however you want to say it. These little extensions of the cuticle were actually being used for thermoregulation and being used to cool the animal off. When it's hot, you can sort of move them back and forth and create airflow and get rid of body heat. And it was thought that they possibly evolved for that purpose first, and then were later on used for flight. And so this is another example of an exaptation. We talked about that earlier when we were talking about the flagella, right? We talked about in bacteria, right, that there are those proteins that were used in the secretory system, which I always think of, oh, you're keeping secrets. No, you're secreting something. But they were used for the purpose of exporting other molecules, and then they got basically, co-opted and transitioned into being used as part of the flagella mechanism. So they evolved for one purpose, but then were now serve a separate, different function. And we're going to be looking at a lot of examples of that for the rest of the course. We're going to see this theme, which makes sense when we look at animals, right? Because a lot of those adaptations have to serve more than one purpose, really. Or they used to be used for one thing, and now they're used for something else, which is an exaptation. Again, selection can only work with what it has at the time, right? You can't create new variation just because you need it. So the best evidence we have is that wings evolved once in insects. Now, this is a homologous trait within insects. It evolved once, and everybody gets it from their common ancestor, right? But it's homoplasious between taxa. Obviously, totally different wing construction in insects versus bats versus birds, for example. So our first insects pop up during the Carboniferous period, which we know was dominated by giant ferns, right? We didn't really have any flowering plants. We're long in the future. But we did have our first gymnosperms. Remember, towards the end of the Carboniferous, where we had the whole climate change, and those giant ferns went bye-bye because the climate got too cold and too dry for them. But that climate was perfect for gymnosperms. And so we start seeing the coevolution of insects with gymnosperms initially, and then as soon as flowering plants came along, that relationship really took off. And we have this very tight coevolutionary relationship between insects and plants. Of course, generally insects eating the plants, but flowering plants, a lot of them rely on insects as pollinators. So it's kind of a love-hate relationship. So after flight evolved, we get an adaptive radiation in insects, and which makes sense, right? Because there's nobody else in the sky. So there are a whole bunch of different lifestyle options, and you have a lot of niches you can fill. And so it makes sense. With something we tend to see right after big breakthroughs, right? Like colonizing land for the first time, and, again, flight, evolution of seeds, sort of all these sort of major breakthroughs, we get lots of adaptive radiation after that. And then, of course, over time, the niches fill up. You have competitive exclusion starts occurring, and maybe the competition gets fierce, and you start to lose some species. Our giant Carboniferous forests, what we dominated by, we had giant insects. I mean, just a whole dragonflies that were like 2 meters long, like 6-foot dragonfly. I can't even imagine that. But but how cool would that be? And they actually have an aquatic larva, which is really interesting. They're predators in both of their predominant life stages, are dragonflies. But once we had flowering plants come along, again, we get this sort of secondary radiation of adaptive radiation of insects, because now you have all these tight coevolutionary relationships can take off, and you getting this huge variety in trajectories. Where the plants are trying to recruit the insects to spread their pollen for them, so they get all of that genetic diversity that they want. But at the same time, they're sort of having to bribe the insects with pollen as a protein source, but also nectar as sugar. And so one of my favorites is a butterfly. It's called a butterfly moth. Excuse me, it's called a hummingbird moth. Sorry, the hummingbird moth. And that's the little guy at the bottom left there. And they hover, they flap their wings, and they hover like a hummingbird. And of course, they're drinking nectar like a hummingbird. So they have a long, proboscis tube, though. It's a moth, so they have a long proboscis tube mouth. The giveaway that it's a moth and not a butterfly is how hairy he is. He has lots of little, they're obviously different hairs than the hairs that we have, right? Different source, different, they're made of different stuff. The other dead giveaway is looking at the antennae. The antennae are sort of feathery antennae, and that's a hallmark of a moth instead of a clubbed antennae like a butterfly. But of course, very clearly not a hummingbird if you look at the segments, right? You have body, segments. It's hard to tell the scale on this, but they're actually about the same size as a hummingbird. There's a whole bunch of them up near my parents' cabin up by Lake Almanor, which is up near Lassen National Park here in Northern California. And so it's really pretty fun to watch them go from flower to flower. And then, of course, I always have to look and go, is that a hummingbird or is that a hummingbird moth? Because they look very similar, and they move really fast, and sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. Okay, so I've got speaking of coevolutionary relationships, I've got a video here coming up, another one from Deep Look, looking at the relationship between bumblebees and in particular, and the flowers that they pollinate and get nectar from.
This buzzing is a secret password, the key to a lock. What this bumblebee is after is pollen. Bumblebees eat pollen. It's high in protein. But the flower doesn't want to give it to just anyone, so it hides it away in those bright yellow anthers. For a flower, that's unusual. Most flowers keep their pollen on the outside of the anther, which is the male part of the flower. Pollen is basically sperm for plants. Most flowers make sugary nectar too. They use it as bait to attract bees and other pollinators, which get coated in pollen along the way. And since bees are messy, they inadvertently scatter some of that pollen onto the female part of the next flower they visit. That's how most flowers have sex. But this type of flower doesn't offer nectar. The only way to get to its pollen is through those tiny pores at the ends. But the bumblebee knows just what to do. It wraps its legs around the flower and bites down on the anthers, that male part of the flower. See those wings shaking? Normally, the bumblebee uses those powerful muscles to flap its wings. That's what makes the buzzing sound when they fly. But here, those muscles vibrate its whole body, so hard and fast that it makes a louder, higher-pitched buzz. This vibration shakes up the pollen trapped inside the anthers until it spews out all over the bumblebee. It's called buzz pollination, and you don't need a bumblebee to do it. A tuning fork will do. The bumblebee grooms the pollen down into sticky sacs on its legs, carries it back to the hive. Only a few types of pollinators, like bumblebees, are capable of buzz pollination. Honeybees can't do it. This field is kind of a free-for-all. Think Las Vegas buffet. Tons of food, but long lines. Lots of competition. Buzz pollination is more like a private club. By only permitting pollinators that know the secret knock, the flower ups the chances that its pollen will end up on flowers from the same club, the same species. The bumblebee? Well, sure, it has to work a little harder, and there's no sweet nectar. But it's a reliable pollen stash that almost no one else has access to. Tomatoes, potatoes, blueberries. All of these need buzz pollination to reproduce. Much of the food we eat owes its existence to that buzz. Our secret password here at Deep Look, I'll be honest, it's that subscribe button. Clicking subscribe releases a cloud of goodwill and gratitude from all of us. And you'll find out about each new episode as soon as it's out. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so just to recap, right? Well, we've covered a lot of turf, right? And we talked about sponges with their choanocytes, our basal taxon, right? So you have choanocytes. Nice shared derived character for sponges, which of course have no true tissues, but have collagen, which is of course that nice animal protein. So there's something else that is a shared derived character for all animals. We don't have very many of those, unfortunately. We have true tissues popping up here. So those are, of course, cells that are organized and perform a shared function. We have radial symmetry, presumably here somewhere. We have diploblastic animals, and of course then we have bilateral symmetry and 3 tissue layers. Here. And then we had we have a nice branch point here. It's 670 million years ago. We didn't talk about Aecila, and we took the this particular branch for Lophotropicozoa and Echidiozoa. And we worked our way through flatworms, as well as mollusks and annelids, right? Here's the trochophore larva that sort of unites mollusks and annelids together. They have that shared larval stage. Let's see, mollusks, right, everybody's got the radula, right, the foot, and the mantle, secretes the shell, right? Annelids have the chetae, those little bristles made of chitin. Some have parapodia as well within that. Flatworms, yeah, not a whole lot of shared derived characters for flatworms either than just they're flat. All right, we went and looked. We skipped nematodes and then we talked about arthropods, right? And so we have those jointed appendages. And our exoskeleton made of chitin. And because we have true segmentation, we also see tagmosis. Just something you see in arthropods and you don't see in annelids generally, who also exhibit true segmentation. But of course, it's homoplasius between annelids and arthropods. All right, so today we're going to look at echinoderms. And they are in deuterostomia. These are again separated by those differences in how the coelom is formed, but we didn't go into a lot of detail on that because it's homoplasius between different animal groups. We used to think it was a shared derived character that united echinoderms and chordates, but it's really not. So there are other characteristics, but we're not going to get into those. And so, yeah, the next 2 lectures, of course, will be on chordates. Okay, so who are our echinoderms? An echinoderm, this is including sea stars, sea urchins, brittle stars, feather stars, sand dollars. These guys are sessile, but they're all mainly marine filter feeders. But we do have some that move around, and in some that are predators as well. So many of them spend their lives stuck to a surface, but quite a few move around, and even if it's just very, very slowly, using their little tube feet. Let's see, I already talked about the deuterostome being homoplasius on the last slide. So we're mainly relying on molecular data at this point to unite echinoderms and chordates as sister taxa. What makes an echinoderm? And basically, where are those shared derived characters, right? You've got pentaradial symmetry. So this is it's not really a subset of radial symmetry. It's actually a form of bilateral symmetry because you're dealing with appendages and body parts that are in multiples of 5, which is an odd number. And so if you lay them out, right, on any plane, you can only cut it in half one way and end up with a mirror image. So that's something that is unique about echinoderms. Nobody else has that particular form of symmetry. So in addition to the pentaradial symmetry, we also have 2 more shared derived characters for echinoderms. One is the water vascular system. This is a network of basically tubes, and each tube ends in a little tube foot, and we have what are called ampulla. These guys, the tube feet actually look and they function very much like a turkey baster, sort of that, or a pipette. Really, it's more like a flexible pipette. You have muscles that in the ampulla that manipulate the water. That's so we have muscles around the ampulla that when they contract, contractions extend tube feet. Cause them to get kind of long and skinny. And many of the tube feet have little suckers on the end. Or a little suction cup. And so they stick to a surface, and then if you relax the ampulla, right, that shortens the tube foot, and you essentially pull the creature forward, or you pull whatever it is that it's attached to towards towards the animal. So this is essentially like, it works very much like the hydrostatic skeleton in a lot of other coelomates. Like annelids, we were talking about having that water, that fluid-filled sac, and you add, you have muscles that act on that, and it causes the shape of the sac to change. Very, very similar thing going on here with the water vascular system. Do not worry about memorizing the names of the different canals and whatever, or what an ampulla is. It's just I wanted to sort of describe exactly how the tube feet get extended using water from the water vascular system. So essentially, while they're underwater, they have an opening to the outside, which is the madreporite, and that's where the water's coming in. And that sort of keeps their endoskeleton sort of charged. And then just under their dermis, they have layers of, they have hard calcified plates that are forming an endoskeleton. Now these can be compacted together, or they can be spread out. And that will make more sense as we go through the different echinoderm groups, because when we look at sea cucumbers, for example, their plates are really spread out, and so their bodies sort of kind of floppy, soggy. And when we look at urchins and sand dollars, those calcified plates are fused together, and they actually have a compact endoskeleton that's called a test. And so it's everything; all those plates are fused together. Other kinds of echinoderms are sort of somewhere in between in terms of how their plates are fused. Okay, on to our different classes of echinoderms. These are ones here that we've already talked about, actually, when we talked about Pisaster, and we talked about keystone species. These are sea stars, aka sometimes called starfish, but since they're not a fish, I'm trying to avoid using that term, right? Easy way to tell whether you're looking at a sea star, asteroidea, or an ophiuroidea, which is a brittle star, is looking at how the arms are fused with basically the middle of the animal, the central disc. For asteroidea, they're fused together. Ophiuroidea, it's very clear where the disc stops and the arm begins. The motion of the tube feet is as I described last time. So we have a suction cup on one end that grips the surface, and you have muscles that are acting on the ampulla, and as part of that water vascular system to extend the tube feet. And of course, when you relax those muscles, it pulls along, and then you can just release your grip on the surface, and then move that tube foot forward and repeat that particular process, and essentially end up crawling along the surface. Asteroids are predominantly predators, and they feed in a rather interesting way. They use their tube feet, and they have a lot of hydraulic pressure in those tube feet, and they essentially are able to overcome the force of the adductor muscles and the bivalves that are trying to keep those two shells together, trying to keep it closed, and they're actually able to pry open the bivalve, again, feeding predominantly on muscles, but they feed on other bivalves as well. And then they take their stomach and basically turn it inside out, and they extrude their stomach out into the shell, in between the shells, secrete the digestive enzymes, and then absorb it, and and then move on. So you end up with just an empty shell when you're done. It's kind of crazy. And they have the ability to regenerate an entire arm. So this is definitely something that folks are who study stem cells and other things are looking at, because it's an ability that most animals don't have. So other here's our ophiuroids. These are brittle stars. And again, you can see from the picture how it's easy to tell where the central disc stops and the leg, or the arm, however you want to say it, begins. You'll also notice that not all of their arms are the same length. And again, this has to do with that calcified endoskeleton. Let me see if I can grab my pen here. And so you have all of this little bit, these are all little tube feet, right? All covering, so you've got a bunch of tube feet over here. But there's very little flesh, right? There's not really very fleshy legs. The legs are quite brittle. And so the calcified plates are close together. Supposed to be an A. And that's, of course, what makes them brittle and easily broken. Hence the name brittle stars. Makes sense? These guys, their tube feet don't have suckers on them, but so they sort of walk or scoot along the bottom, and they kind of move their arms in a way that looks like they're rowing along the bottom as they scoot. They're scavengers, so they're just picking up whatever is on the bottom there, so they're good detritivores in that regard. Some of them are predators, and some of them use their tube feet and their arms for filter feeding. So we get a variety of different kind of lifestyles in brittle stars.
Okay, so you're probably looking at these things wondering, what on earth is this crazy looking thing? So crinoids are some of our oldest echinoderms. We think they're actually our basal taxon. We have fossil crinoids that look almost exactly like living species. So clearly they have a body plan and a lifestyle that works for them. And they have been very successful in the past. They are much more rare today, and that may be due to changes, of course, in our living communities, or it could be due to changes in climate, or of course, just a various number of possible factors, reasons for that. So crinoids are also known as feather stars. They generally have this long stalk, which they attach to the substrate. The two I've shown here in the photographs have much shorter stalks and are attached again to an uneven surface. But of course they are, you can tell that they're an echinoderm because we have arms, much more than 5 arms, but they are still in multiples of 5 generally. Also the little appendages that look kind of like an arthropod's arm, right? They look like they could be, right, some sort of filter feeding arthropod, quite possibly, or maybe even an annelid. You can, well, we can't in this photograph, but if you could zoom in closely, right? And you would be looking for joints, right, in those appendages. And if you don't see jointed appendages, it's not an arthropod, right? So if you were able to zoom in closely, you would actually see that all those little projections there off of each of the arms, those are the tube feet. And so they are using them in a way that other echinoderms use their tube feet, which is to not only do respiration, but also for food capture. So they're filter feeding with their tube feet and just suspending them in the water column and catching whatever, eggs, larvae, whatever organic particles sort of float by, and then either, and then funneling that food to their mouth.
And just to reiterate, no, you don't have to be able to spell all these different class names. So just be able to recognize them and know which animal they go with. And I will give you those on either as an answer option, or if I give you a phylogenetic tree, it'll have the names already on there. You'll just have to fill in the characteristics that go with them. Okay, so Holothuroidea, these are your sea cucumbers. So yeah, they look kind of like a cucumber, I guess. Maybe not really, I don't know. They also look superficially, right, like a sea slug or something like that, which would be a mollusk. And so, of course, the way you can tell, right, would be to flip it over and look for the rows of tube feet, right, which you can see underneath it. All those little tube feet, right, that have all the little suckers on them. And they're crawling along the bottom. And they would have 5 rows of tube feet because we still have pentaradial symmetry, even though these guys are sort of long and skinny looking. As I mentioned earlier, the endoskeleton is reduced, so those calcified plates are really spread out and less numerous, so the whole body is kind of floppy, soggy. And of course, they have some tube feet that are modified into tentacles around their mouth, and some of our sea cucumbers, a lot of them are detritivores, so just picking up organic matter off the bottom, which again makes them really great recyclers and decomposers. Interesting defensive mechanism they have. If you hassle them too much, they basically turn their intestines inside out, and you get a handful, or if you're a predator, a mouthful of intestine, which is, needless to say, pretty disgusting. And then they can regrow their intestines. So again, the ability to regrow body parts in echinoderms is something that is very definitely of interest to humans in terms of medical applications. But it's also just fascinating because a lot of animals can't do that. So why this particular group can, I don't know if anyone can answer that question yet. Okay, on to our last class of echinoderms, Echinoidea. This includes sand dollars and sea urchins. And as you can see here, we've got the endoskeleton fused together, those calcified plates fused together to form the test, which is this whole thing, right? On the left, this is basically a sea urchin endoskeleton with, but you can see, right, all the little holes. So we have rows of tube feet. Here we've got, 1 row, 2 rows. It's basically like you took a sea star and curled it up, right, and sort of fused all the arms together. And so you can see where the arms, right, you can see where they used to be. There's one, right, there's another one here, all those little holes. So the holes are where the tube feet were. And then of course this whole area, right, is the arm. I'm going to put that in quotations because it's really like it's coiled up, and again you just fuse those calcified plates together. And a lot of those little bumps here are where the sort of a socket for the spines on the sea urchin, which is what you mainly see here. And if you flip them over, if you flip an urchin over or a sand dollar over, if a sand dollar is alive, right, the sand dollar is going to be covered with little tube feet as well. So here's little tube feet, right? So all these little guys, little tube feet. Ah, getting really crazy here with the pen. All right. And then for echinoids, we have another shared derived character that only they have, and that's the specialized jaw. And so you see essentially you've got 5 little teeth here, and each one is under its own separate muscular control. So each tooth is controlled independently, which is pretty cool. And they're very strong. Again, they're calcified, essentially calcified teeth, and they're really, really strong. So again, a lot of our echinoids, like urchins, right? These are often tend to be grazing herbivores, as we noted earlier when we were talking about. One second. Write and think at the same time. Can't do it. When we were talking about keystone species, right? We were talking about sea otters as keystones in the kelp forest, and urchins, of course, grazing on the kelp. And they've, you know, if the otters are not there keeping their populations down, they tend to overgraze the kelp, and you don't have a kelp forest because the urchins have eaten it all down to nothing. So they're grazing, but sand dollars actually eat sand grains. I know it sounds bizarre, but they crush them with their jaw. And essentially inside the sand grains, there's usually a lot of bacteria or algae that are either living on the surface or actually inside the sand grain in a very weird way. And so they're accessing those nutrients by doing that. So sand dollars are actually great at making the sandy bottom even finer and pummeling it down and making those sand grains even smaller as a result of crushing them to get the nutrients. So I've got some video. If you don't believe me that sand dollars eat sand, some of them actually also do filter feed with their tube feed. But I've got some video of a sand dollar feeding here coming up.
It's a beachcomber's prize. But this sand dollar is just an empty husk, a skeleton. This is what sand dollars really look like. Off the coast of California, Pacific sand dollars snuggle up together like a big pile of purple sea cookies. They're fuzzy, almost cuddly. But look closer. That fuzz is actually made up of tiny spines. Thousands of them. Some long and spiky, others rounder. Mixed in are miniature tube feet with grabby little suckers on the ends. They use them to meticulously sift the sand and pass the grains down the line until they reach the sand dollar's mouth. At the very center of its underside, buried under all those spines. Sand dollars eat sand. They're after the algae and bacteria that coat the grains. And these sand dollars can also stand themselves up on their sides to use the long spines around their edges to trap tiny plankton floating by. So what about that part that looks like a flower with 5 petals? It's called the petaloid. They have special tube feet there that help the sand dollar breathe, absorbing oxygen out of the water. You can see that same 5-point body plan on the skeletons of their relatives, like starfish and sea urchins. In fact, sand dollars are just a type of flat sea urchin. But while their cousins prefer the rocky shore, chock full of life and spots to hide, sand dollars don't have such a cozy place to live. They're at the mercy of what's basically an undersea desert, thrashed and sandblasted. So being flat is an advantage. They're sleeker, streamlined against the powerful currents. And they have another scrupulous solution for staying put. Not all sand is the same. Mixed in there are some extra heavy grains. They're made of magnetite, a type of iron ore. Scientists think that as they grow, young sand dollars sort them out and swallow them, grain after grain. The heavy ore builds up inside their bodies and helps weigh them down to the sea floor. At the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, researchers used X-rays of sand dollars to look for it. See those bright white areas? Those are the pockets of magnetite. That's how these tireless little creatures can hack it, out here in such turbulent waters where most other things can't. Turns out, it takes a lot of work just to lay around.